There is a familiar story told about technology startups around the world. Young ambitious founders. Rising digital connectivity. Billions of dollars in venture capital flowing across borders. And an industry repeatedly described as the future of the global economy. Every year, headlines repeat the same message. The startup boom is here. Optimism is everywhere. At pitch competitions in London, startup accelerators in San Francisco, innovation summits in Moscow and Paris. Young founders present ambitious visions. Investors nod approvingly. Deals are signed. Press releases are written. And yet, beneath that optimism lies a quieter reality. Most tech startups fail. In the UK. In the United States. In Russia. In France. Not slowly. Not gently. But repeatedly. According to various reports, between 70 and 90% of startups do not survive past their third year. This is a global phenomenon. Startups fail everywhere. But the conditions that create failure vary by region. Each market has its own structural challenges, and many are invisible to outside observers. This is not about blaming founders. It is not about celebrating rare success stories while ignoring the thousands who struggled. And it is not about promoting pessimism. Instead, this is a structural explanation. The central question is simple. If the opportunity is real, and it is, why do so many tech startups fail across the UK, USA, Russia, and France, and why do a few succeed where most do not? To answer this, we must move beyond motivation, intelligence, or effort, and examine systems, incentives, and constraints in each market. What you are about to hear is not comfortable, but it is necessary. When we say a startup failed, what do we actually mean? In popular discourse, failure usually means a company shut down. Doors closed. Websites offline. Team disbanded. But in reality, failure takes several forms. Some startups close entirely, running out of money, unable to raise another round, unable to pay salaries. Others survive but never grow. They exist in what investors call zombie companies. Alive, but economically irrelevant. Revenue flat. Team shrinking. Investors silent. Some are acquired, not because they succeeded, but because continuing independently became impossible. The acquisition is framed as a win. But often, it is a managed exit from an unsustainable position. And many disappear quietly, without headlines, without obituaries, without explanations. They simply stop posting. Stop updating. Stop existing. This matters because public narratives suffer from survivorship bias. We see the winners. In London we hear about Revolut and Deliveroo. In Silicon Valley it's Uber and Airbnb. In Moscow it's Yandex. In Paris it's BlaBlaCar. But we rarely see the thousands of attempts that did not work. The fintech app that never reached profitability. The logistics platform that could not scale beyond one city. The e-commerce site that closed after 18 months. Failure in this context is not moral. It does not mean founders were lazy, unintelligent, or uncommitted. It is structural. It is the result of conditions, constraints, and mismatches between model and market. And to understand it, we must first understand the model most startups are built on, and how it plays out differently across these four major markets. Most tech startups follow a familiar playbook. Build software. Acquire users rapidly. Scale on low marginal costs. Raise capital to fund growth. Exit through acquisition or IPO. This model was perfected in Silicon Valley and exported worldwide. But here's what most people miss. The model assumes certain conditions exist, and those conditions vary dramatically by country. In the United States, particularly in Silicon Valley, the model works because the ecosystem is optimized for it. Deep capital markets. A culture that celebrates risk-taking. Strong intellectual property protections. Access to top technical talent. And a massive domestic market of 330 million consumers with high purchasing power. In the United Kingdom, startups face a different reality. The domestic market is smaller, just 67 million people. Brexit has complicated access to European markets. Regulatory requirements are strict, especially in fintech, which is a major UK startup sector. Talent costs in London rival Silicon Valley, but exit opportunities are fewer. The UK has produced unicorns, yes, but the path is narrower and more constrained. In France, the challenges multiply. Labor laws are rigid, making it difficult and expensive to hire and fire. The cultural attitude toward failure is less forgiving than in the US or UK. Business regulations are complex. Taxation is high. And while President Macron has pushed La French tech initiatives, the reality on the ground is that French startups often struggle with bureaucracy that American founders never encounter. In Russia, the situation is even more complex. Capital is concentrated among a small number of oligarchs and state-connected investors. International funding is limited due to sanctions and geopolitical tensions. The legal system is unpredictable. Property rights can be unclear. And the domestic market, while large at 140 million people, has lower average purchasing power than Western Europe or the US. Additionally, Russian startups face significant challenges expanding internationally due to political factors. The same business model, applied in 4 different markets, produces 4 different sets of constraints. This is not an execution problem. This is a structural mismatch between universal startup playbooks and local realities. Let's talk about what these constraints actually mean in practice. In the United States, the primary challenge is not infrastructure or regulation. It's competition and winner-takes-all dynamics. The market is so large and capital so abundant that once a company achieves dominance, it becomes nearly impossible to compete. Think about ride-sharing. Uber won. Everyone else struggled or disappeared. Think about social media. Facebook won. Dozens of competitors failed. The US market rewards speed and scale above all else, which means if you're not the fastest, you're often dead. In the United Kingdom, regulatory compliance becomes a massive cost center. A fintech startup in London must navigate FCA regulations, data protection laws, anti-money laundering requirements, and post-Brexit complications. Each adds cost. Each adds time. Each reduces the capital available for growth. A UK startup competing with a US startup is fighting with one hand tied behind its back, not because of inferior talent, but because of regulatory burden. In France, labor costs and bureaucracy kill startups slowly. French labor law requires extensive documentation for hiring. Firing employees is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Social charges on salaries can add 50% to employment costs. A French startup with 20 employees has overhead that an American startup with 20 employees does not. This makes French startups less competitive globally, not because the ideas are worse, but because the cost structure is unsustainable. In Russia, the problem is access to capital and rule of law. Russian startups struggle to raise international funding. Domestic funding is limited and often comes with political strings. Intellectual property theft is a real concern. And the legal system does not reliably protect founders. A successful Russian startup can find itself under pressure from larger, politically connected competitors, or face regulatory harassment that has nothing to do with business merit. These are not minor differences. These are fundamental structural constraints that determine survival rates. Now let's talk about venture capital, because the incentive structure is the same everywhere, but the reality differs by market. Venture capital is not neutral money. It is not patient money. It comes with expectations. Rapid growth. Large addressable markets. Exponential returns. And profitable exits, usually within 5 to 7 years. In the United States, this model works. The market is large enough to support hypergrowth. Exit opportunities are abundant through IPOs and acquisitions, and the ecosystem is designed to facilitate this. Silicon Valley has perfected the venture capital cycle. In the United Kingdom, venture capital exists but exits are harder. The London Stock Exchange is less favorable to tech IPOs than Nasdaq. Acquisition opportunities are fewer. And many UK startups end up being acquired by American companies at valuations below what they might have achieved in the US. This makes returns lower for investors, which makes capital scarcer for founders. In France, venture capital is growing but constrained by culture and regulation. French investors are more risk-averse than American or British investors. They demand profitability earlier. They are less willing to fund long shots. And the exit market is even smaller than the UK. This creates a vicious cycle. Limited exits mean limited returns. Limited returns mean limited capital. Limited capital means fewer successful startups. In Russia, venture capital is dominated by a small number of players with political connections. International investors are largely absent due to sanctions and geopolitical risk. This means Russian startups have fewer funding options, more pressure to conform to investor demands, and limited ability to raise follow-on rounds if initial investors lose interest. The result is misalignment across all four markets. Instead of building resilient businesses, founders optimize for fundraising milestones. Metrics become performative. User growth is prioritized over unit economics. Expansion happens before the core model is proven. Sustainability is postponed. When funding slows, as it inevitably does during global downturns or shifts in investor sentiment, the model collapses. Companies that were growing on capital, not revenue, suddenly have no path forward. Layoffs begin. Pivots are announced. Quietly, the company shrinks or closes. This happens in New York. It happens in London. It happens in Paris. It happens in Moscow. This is not because the founders failed. It is because the incentives were never aligned with local reality. Let me give you specific examples from each market. In the United States, a food delivery startup in a second-tier city raised $10 million. Investors expected it to compete with DoorDash and Uber Eats. But those companies had already achieved dominance. They had more capital, better logistics, and brand recognition. The startup burned through its funding trying to acquire customers with unsustainable discounts. Within 2 years it shut down. Not because the service was bad, but because the market was already won. In the United Kingdom, a fintech startup spent 18 months navigating FCA approval processes. During that time, competitors in less regulated markets moved faster. By the time the UK startup launched, it was behind. It raised a Series A but never achieved the growth metrics investors demanded. It was acquired at a loss. The founders did everything right. But regulatory timing killed momentum. In France, a software-as-a-service company targeting small businesses discovered that French labor laws made scaling impossible. Every new hire required extensive contracts. Firing underperformers was legally complex and expensive. The company's burn rate was double what an equivalent American company would face. It could not raise additional funding. It closed. In Russia, a social media platform gained traction but faced pressure from a state-connected competitor. Advertising partners were warned not to work with them. Their office lease was suddenly terminated. Key employees were offered jobs at the competing platform. The founders had no legal recourse. The company effectively shut down within months. These are not failures of vision or execution. These are failures of model-market fit. The universal startup playbook collided with local constraints, and the gap was too expensive to bridge. Despite these constraints, some startups do succeed in each market. And their success is instructive. They do not succeed by following the Silicon Valley playbook blindly. They succeed by adapting to local realities. In the United States, successful startups either dominate a niche too small for giants to care about, or they move so fast that they achieve dominance before competition arrives. Companies like Stripe succeeded not by competing directly with existing payment processors, but by serving a market those processors ignored, developers who wanted simple API-based payments. In the United Kingdom, successful startups leverage regulatory compliance as a moat. Companies like Revolut and Monzo spent years getting banking licenses. Those licenses are now barriers to entry that protect them from competition. They turned regulatory burden into competitive advantage. In France, successful startups focus on profitability early. Companies like BlaBlaCar never relied on massive venture rounds. They grew sustainably, charged users from day one, and built a business that could survive without constant capital injections. They adapted to French investor expectations rather than fighting them. In Russia, successful startups either serve the domestic market exclusively, avoiding international complications, or they relocate. Many successful Russian founders eventually moved their companies to the US or Europe to access capital and escape local constraints. Yandex succeeded domestically but faces limitations expanding internationally. These companies share common traits across markets. First, they design for local constraints from day one. They do not assume conditions that do not exist. Second, they scale deliberately. They understand that premature scaling in constrained environments is lethal. Third, they focus on cash flow earlier. They do not rely solely on venture capital. They charge customers. They manage burn rate aggressively. Fourth, they turn constraints into advantages. Regulation becomes a moat. Limited capital forces discipline. Local market knowledge creates differentiation. Their success is not accidental. It is adaptive. The failure of tech startups globally is often framed as a founder problem. A lack of skill. A lack of persistence. A lack of vision. It is not. It is a systems problem. Universal startup models collide with local constraints. Capital incentives misalign with market realities. Regulatory environments, competitive dynamics, and cultural factors create barriers that no amount of founder effort can overcome. The solution is not fewer startups. Entrepreneurship is valuable. Innovation is necessary. And it is not blind optimism. Pretending constraints do not exist does not make them disappear. The solution is realism. Acknowledgement that the Silicon Valley playbook does not work everywhere. That markets differ fundamentally. That success requires adaptation, not replication. In the United States, founders must understand winner-takes-all dynamics and move with speed that other markets do not require. In the United Kingdom, founders must navigate regulation skillfully and build it into their strategy from day one. In France, founders must focus on sustainable growth and work within labor and tax systems that cannot be wished away. In Russia, founders must carefully manage political risk and consider whether international relocation is necessary for long-term success. Until startup models reflect these truths, until founders design for the environment they are actually in, not the environment they wish existed, failure will remain the norm rather than the exception. This is not a pessimistic conclusion. It is a practical one. The startups that will succeed are not the ones that blindly replicate Silicon Valley. They are the ones that understand their context deeply and build accordingly. Strategically, deliberately, sustainably. That is the real opportunity. Not in pretending all markets are the same, but in building for what each market actually is.